Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are taking a look at the last standard infantry pattern of the Lee Enfield rifle. This is the rifle number 4 Mark II. Now there would continue to be Lee Enfields used in the sniper role and a few other specialty roles after this, but after the Mark II came the L1A1 self-loading rifle. So what we have here is actually a relatively minor mechanical change to the trigger specifically, and it's the result of basically production expediencies during World War II. Now, one of the problems that the British ran into with mass production of the Lee Enfield during the war was shortage of properly dried wood to make the stocks out of. And so they developed some kiln drying systems that would allow them to make use of wood in a much shorter time frame than typically required. Normally you have to let the wood cure and dry for a long period of time before you can actually use it. Well, kiln drying allowed them to expedite that process, but it wasn't always perfectly done. And what they found is, by the end of World War II, a lot of the stocks kind of had some shrinkage or warpage issues, which normally wouldn't be that big of a deal, except that on the standard number 4 rifle, the trigger is pinned to the trigger guard, the sear is pinned to the receiver, and the trigger guard is screwed to the front handguard, to the wood front handguard. And so what would happen is, if the handguard swelled or shrank, it would actually change the interaction between the trigger and the sear, and it could substantially change the trigger pull, both the weight and the feel of the trigger pull in the rifles. And the British wanted to prevent that. They wanted to stop that. Like, that's a problem. So they started trials in 1946 of a test batch of rifles where they moved the trigger and pinned it up into the receiver. It would take a couple years to actually finish all of these trials, probably because this wasn't a huge priority. The war was over at this point. But in 1949, they formally adopted the new type designation of the rifle, number 4 Mark II. So let's take a look at this one. We'll pull it apart and I'll show you the difference internally between this and the earlier Mark I. This is a particularly nice, clean example. Of course, that's because none of the Mark IIs went through World War II. Of course, this was a post-war modification, which is a little surprising, frankly. Not a whole lot of other people were still trying to upgrade their bolt-action rifles after World War II, but this is one. So we have number 4 Mark II. The F indicates that it was manufactured by Fazakerley. This was produced in June of 1953. And the PF there is the serial number, 309167. The one way you can easily distinguish a Mark I or 1 star from a Mark II without having to actually see the markings is by this section on the stock. So the Mark I guns have this sort of sheet metal tab here that holds a reinforcing screw, and that tab was done away with on the Mark II. This isn't a mechanically substantial change, but it is something that's visually distinguishable. So that's how you can tell them apart. Now let's actually take a look inside. Now to take a look at where these actually differ, I have gone ahead and pulled out the screws holding the trigger guards in place, so we can take these out and take a look at each of them independently. If we start with just the trigger guards, here's the Mark I, and you can see the trigger pinned right into the trigger guard. And here's the Mark II, which is not. And on the rifles, you can see that the receiver socket here on the Mark II has been extended forward a little bit. Note that it cuts off flush right there, but it's extended forward here. And that little boss has the pin that holds the trigger in place. So the trigger really didn't even change design. They just moved where it was attached. So you can see here how if the wood swells or shrinks, it's going to impact exactly where the trigger itself is sitting in relation to the sear there, and that will impact your trigger pull. So that is it for the difference between the Mark I and the Mark II. There is one more little change that was made, although it's not officially part of the Mark II. It is a change that was made late in production of Mark II rifles, didn't get its own new designation. But here we have a 1955 production example. And if you look very carefully right here, you'll see a slight subtle difference. This is actually a holdover from the very early trials versions of the number 4. This is the boss that originally provided enough material to mount a magazine cutoff. Now, of course, the cutoff had been removed by the time the number 4 Mark I was formally adopted, but the receiver tooling wasn't changed. So this boss remained in place until development of the number 5 rifles, the jungle carbine. The jungle carbine had its own different, unique receiver forging that did not include this boss. So late in production of the the Mark IIs, they actually went and decided to unitize production so that they could use number 5 receiver forgings with the number 4 rifles. And so that's when you get receivers late in production that don't have that boss included because they weren't in the original forgings. So the stock is slightly different as well. A stock made for a late production gun will not fit onto an early one because it won't have the cutout for that little boss. Naturally, there would be refurbishment programs to bring older rifles up to new modern specification, and this would result in 2 additional designations. So we would also have the number 4 Mark I/II and the Mark I/III. And what's going on here is if you had a number 4 Mark I, and you can still just barely see the very subtle markings there. This was originally a Mark I rifle. It was given a factory thorough refit or refurbishment there at Fazakerley, and it was updated to Mark II configuration, as you can tell by this screw. And as a result, it gains the designation Mark I/II. Refurbishment was done in 1952, and they remarked the gun with its new designation, which is why these markings over here are worn down and just finished over. In addition, of course, there were a lot of Canadian and American-made rifles, number 4 Mark I stars, that were also in service and were subject to being refitted. And a Mark I star upgraded to Mark II status would be called a I/III. So that's what we have here. This one was done in 1954. Interestingly, on this one, you can really see where they kept the original lower handguard or front stock and took out that sheet metal tab and replaced it with just the screw. It's kind of cool. You can actually see that on this particular example. With the end of World War II, of course, serious demand for number 4 rifles pretty well dried up. BSA would stop producing them by, I believe, 1947. Fazakerley held on rather longer. Fazakerley made rifles into the 1950s. They made a batch of them under contract for Ireland. 1955 was really the last year of any serious production of rifles. There may have been a few more that trickled out afterwards, but not many. Obviously, the UK was well on its way towards adoption of a self-loading rifle, the FN FAL, and they just didn't need these anymore. So it is kind of remarkable how long they kept tweaking and upgrading and perfecting this rifle, even though it was clearly on its way out. But that, frankly, just makes it kind of more interesting for the collector. So if you've been watching this series for an extended period, well, this is pretty much the end of the series. We do have some more kind of specialty rifles that I'll be talking about, sniper modifications and that sort of thing. But as far as the life of the Lee Enfield as a standard issue service rifle, beginning way back in the 1880s, it ran through the number 4 Mark II here, and this is the end of the line. So hopefully you've enjoyed this series of videos. Hopefully you learned something. Thanks for watching.